Welcome back, everyone. Today I played in round 9 of the Canada's tournament being held here in Madrid, Spain. Now today I had the black piece against Teimour Radjabov, being half point behind Fabiano and 1.5 points, I guess you could say, behind Johan Nepomniachtchi, and with both of them playing, I thought I would take my chance against Teimour Radjabov. So without further ado, let's jump right into the game. So the game starts with e4, I play e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and now I play knight f6, choosing to play the Berlin defense. Now it's worth noting that if I had perhaps had more time last night, say I did not play a 7-hour game and everything else, perhaps with a little bit more time, I would have chosen to play something sharper, but alas, I decided to stick with the repertoire that I prepared for the event. So after knight f6, d3 is played, bishop c5, c3, now I castle. Castle is played by Teimour, I play d5, knight bd2, all standard theory so far. Now I trade on e4 and I play a5. The reason behind playing a5 is simply to stop white from taking more space on the queen side with b4. So now queen c2 is played, and I go queen e7. I won't go into the intricacies of all the different lines, but if white takes on c6 and plays knight e5 here, for example, after rook e8, black will win back the pawn on e4, and he should be doing quite well. So queen c2 is played, so now I play queen to e7, a4 is played by Teimour, now I go knight a7, bishop e2, and now I go back to c6. Now, I did recall this being the correct line in the file, which is why I played it. Now, it's not so much to try and force white into a repetition, but it's simply the best move to play. So now knight b3 is played, and here I sort of make a mistake. I go a little bit off script, and I try too hard to create an imbalance with my next move by playing bishop a7. What I should have done is I should have put the bishop either on b6 or d6. Now b6 is probably the most logical, and the reason is that if white tries bishop b5 now, I can simply move the knight away and the pawn on a5 is guarded, whereas in the game, after bishop a7, bishop b5, now if I move the knight away, he can just gobble on a5, and if I take on f2 after rook takes, rook a5, b4, rook a8, and let's just say a5 for example, white is much better with the two bishops. So in the game here, after a long think, I decided to play bishop g4. Now this is what I would say was my attempt to go for it, to try and create something imbalanced and to try and win and give myself an outside chance at perhaps winning the tournament. Now as it turns out, unfortunately this is a very serious error, and I simply end up with a much worse position after what happens in the game, which is bishop takes knight. Now I take on f3 here, and here Teimour takes on f3. Now for some reason, during the game, when I was calculating bishop g4, my assumption was that after knight a5, queen e6, with ideas like knight h5 and f5 and queen h3, I thought I was going to get a huge attack on the king side, and I simply thought that Teimour would take a draw here with bishop takes b7, knight g4, g takes f3, queen h4, threatening checkmate, and after pawn takes knight, there's a repetition with queen takes, queen f3, queen g4, queen f3 with the yo-yo, and the game would end in a draw. However, Teimour surprisingly took very quickly on f3, and now I took back on c6, and after knight takes a5, I still thought that I would be fine after queen e6 because of the aforementioned ideas that I have, like queen h3, knight h5, f5, it looks very scary with the white king being open, but unfortunately for me, Teimour finds an excellent move here, the best move according to the computers, which is this great move, queen e2. Now the reason this move is so important is because if white tries to play a move like b4, for example, after bishop b6, knight b3, now when I go queen h3, queen e2, knight h5, f5 is a very serious threat because the knight is very passive on b3. And the reason that queen e2 is so strong here is that now the knight is going to stay on a5, and if I ever play like queen h3, the knight can simply gobble on c6, and if I go bishop b6 here, white has this great c4 square from which the knight can get to e3 and f5. You can also get back to g2, and white is simply much better. Once Teimour played queen e2, I was very, very unhappy here, and I was in a bit of a predicament because I had used a lot of time already, but I wasn't sure what I should do, so I decided that instead of playing what the computer considers the best move, which is taking on f2, and playing this sort of late middle game end game where white is probably quite a bit better. Here he's got a connected trio of pawns. His pawn can maybe even go to a7. It's a pretty unpleasant position objectively to play. Nonetheless, I probably should have gone into this, but by this point I figured, you know what? I'm still going to follow through. I'm going to play my attack or go for the attack that I think is there. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but I'm not going to have any second thoughts or any regrets about not going for it. So I choose to play knight h5. Teimour plays b4 here, supporting the knight on a5. And now I play king h8. The reason I play king h8 is I'd love to go f5 and open up the f file here, but white has queen c4 or even potentially queen a2. Both of these squares would force an exchange of the queens because my king is on the light square diagonal. So I go king h8 first, preparing f5 because let's just say bishop b2 f5. White plays like queen c4. Now I can just go queen g6 check, for example. So here Teimour plays king h1, and now I play h6. Sort of a waiting move here because, again, the problem is if I play f5 here, which was my initial idea, I think white can even play a move like queen c4 here, and I don't have a good square for my queen. Ideally, I'd like to go queen f6, but then white can play knight takes c6, and the problem is that whenever I take on e4, white can just take with the queen, and he just guards everything from e4, and if I don't take on e4, I don't really have anything happening in a hurry. And if white gets a move like, say, queen h4, and he can trade, for example, this is just GG's, because after rook g1, even if I get queen h3, queen e2, this king is so safe here on h1 with the rook on the open file and the bishop stopping knight f4 that I could simply resign. So here I play h6, sort of a waiting move to see what Teimour is going to do. And now he plays rook g1 here, and I go f5. Perhaps I could have played something like knight f4, which was another idea that I saw here, but I thought that after takes, for example, queen c4, I didn't really see a big attack again. Even queen h3, knight c6, queen f3, or sorry, not knight c6, rook g2 first, queen f3, knight c6. And again, with this passed a pawn pushing up the board, I think this is close to lost. So instead I play f5, following through, just deciding, you know what, I'm going to follow the concept, I'm going to play for it. If it's not good, well, that's just life, you live with the decision. So Teimour plays rook g2 here, which I actually was surprised by during the game. I thought after pawn takes pawn, let's say I take with the rook, I thought that something like bishop e3 here, I didn't know what I was doing. I thought rook g2 was a little bit dubious at the time, but I was low on clock here, and I just couldn't come up with a great idea. So I took on e4, he takes back, and now I play this move rook f6. I guess computer wanted to play queen h3, but again, after a move like queen g4 here, I can trade on f3, which I saw during the game, but after takes, rook c3, knight takes a7, and I thought it was bishop e3, although computer says a5 here. Either way, with this passed a pawn, these past two pawns here, actually I guess b pawn's not a passed pawn, but the a4 and b4 pawns and white being able to put the rooks on the b and a files, it just feels very unpleasant to play, and I just didn't want to go into an endgame. I thought I'm going to try to find an attack, and as I said before, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but I'm going to stick to the principles. So here I play rook f6, guarding the pawn on c6 with the idea of stacking on the f file and going after these two pawns on f3 and f2. Here Teimour plays bishop e3, and now during this period of time when Teimour was thinking, he was ahead by about 50 minutes on the clock. I was calculating both bishop e3 and I think b5, these two moves. And during this 20-minute think by Teimour, I actually calculated the line that I played in the game, which was taking and going queen d5. Now, I was really unsure whether I should trade or maybe just play queen d5 right away, but I thought at the end of the day, somehow the rook on a7 doesn't feel quite right. And also, if we get to this position with takes and say white can play something like queen g4, somehow it felt loose to me, and I didn't really feel it. So I thought, even though it looks weird to undouble the pawns and offer the queen trade, I thought that this was the right way to play it. So I blitz this out. And now Teimour at this moment, I think he had about 40 minutes to my 18 or around there, or maybe a little bit more even. And he used about a half hour, and he found what I think is the best line, at least from a human standpoint. Perhaps computers say there's something better, but he found this great move, queen g4. Already here, I was starting to get quite optimistic when he was thinking, because if white trades the queens, now f3 is weak, and after rook f2, I can play this great move d4. White takes back, and let's just say white grabs. After rook b6 here, black is probably close to drawing, because if you put either rook on the b file, I can simply take the knight and win the rook. And if you move the knight, now I take, and all the pawns are super split, so this should be an easy draw. And if white plays something like knight c4, for example, after a move like rook c6, rook c2, I can even play d3 here, and they're very good drawing chances for black. So I was really starting to get optimistic around this time, but Teimour, to his credit, spent about a half hour, and he played this great move, queen g4. Now, the reason this is a great move is because after I take on f3, we reach this endgame where I still have the double pawns, and my knight is sort of out to lunch on the rim here as well. I'd love my knight to be somewhere in the center of the board, but it's on the edge here, so it's very hard to play. So I played the move c5, trying to get rid of the double pawns. White cannot capture, of course, because then you lose the knight on a5. And now Teimour plays knight c6, which I think is a great move. And here I missed probably my last opportunity to maybe save the game. Here I took on b4. What I probably should have done is I probably should have played knight f6, leaving this pawn on pre on c5, because if white takes, now it's just one lone pass pawn, and after a move like knight e4, hitting the pawns on c3 and c5, black should be fine. But I didn't do this because I thought that after a move like b5, for example, and a5, knight c3, rook b2, it looked very, very scary to me. Now, the computer actually says that you can maybe you can go rook e3 here and still save the game somehow, but with these two pawns marching up the board, if I'm wrong, I'm just going to lose. So I didn't do this. Also, I think a5 right away is maybe quite scary as well. Say I go knight e4, there may be something like rook c1. Even this looks very, very hard to play because white has a very clear plan of going b5 a6 or b5 b6 potentially, and a computer again probably will be able to save this with perfect play, but with about 5 minutes on the clock, no increment, I don't think it's realistic to find a defense here. Maybe if I had half hour on the clock, it's more realistic, but with 5 minutes, I don't think it's possible. So instead I take on b4, which is a mistake, because now after pawn takes, the problem is that if I go knight f6, first of all, white can take the pawn, but again, just b5 and a5, and these pawns are just pushing up the board really, really fast, and the central pawn on e3 doesn't matter, but this knight on c6 is guarded by the pawn on b5, and a6, a7 is coming in, and this is really, really bad. There also are some shades of the endgame that I had against Levon Aronian from Berlin, where I also, with the white piece in a Berlin, got a great knight on c6, anchored by a pawn on b5. So here I played rook f6. Now b5 is played by Teimour. I go rook d6, a5, knight f6, trying to get the knight back at some point, but it's just too little too late. So now I plays a6, and here I played knight d7, which is based on a faulty plan. What I probably should have played was rook d5, but still after rook b2 here with the idea of a7, I think it's close lost. I can maybe go knight d7, but now again rook c1, the idea is knight a5 or knight e7. I can't really save this pawn on c7, and the computer says this is simply an easy win for white. So I play knight d7, he goes a7 here, and now I played king g8, which is sort of the final blunder. Again, I can maybe go rook d5, but after rook b2, let's just say knight b6, for example, the knight guards the pawn on a7, so now white can go rook f1 with the idea of rook f2 to stack. He'll infiltrate either on f8 or f7. Say I play some random moves like this. If I go king g8, there is knight e7, which wins, but even rook f7 here with the infiltration, this is completely winning as well. And if I don't and white gets rook f8, this is also simply game over because this knight guards the pawn, and white will eventually be able to promote the pawn, or I'll have to sack the knight for the pawn. So after a7, I play king g8, and now Teimour finds rook c2. And at this point, the game is simply lost because I don't really have a good move. The idea behind king g8 is that, let's just say white just waits forever. If I can somehow get my king to the queen side here, for example, say the king can get to like c8 and b7, there are maybe some chances to save the game, although even here computer says it's +2, so probably not even realistic even if I get the king over. But that's why I played king g8. The idea was to try to run the king over, but unfortunately after rook c2, now when I go king f7, white has a very nice move, knight b4, and I can't really save the pawn on c7, so I play c5 here. Teimour plays en passant, he takes the pawn, b takes c6, I go knight b6, and now he plays e4. Pretty much any move wins, but this is simply one of the cleanest. Go knight c8, trying to win the pawn on a7, goes rook a2, play king e6, Teimour plays rook a6, and now I try rook d4, knight d5, trying to go knight c7, and now I play king d6. Again, hoping for some sort of miracle here, but unfortunately Teimour finds one of a couple of wins with the very simple move knight to b6. And here I resign the game in view of the fact that if I play rook a7, for example, white can take the knight with check. If I trade the knights on b6, the problem is after king c7, white does not play rook b8, but white goes rook b7 first. And now if I take the pawn after rook b8, the pawn on a7 guards the rook, and the rook on a1 guards the pawn on a7, and I have to sacrifice the rook, and this would be a very easy win. And if I go king c8 here, there are many ways for white to win, but probably the simplest way would be to play something like rook to b1 here, and just rook b8 next move. And again, after rook d8, rook b8 check, king c7, rook takes rook. Take with a king, there's rook b8, wins the game. If I take with a rook here, now there's rook b7 check, king takes pawn, rook b8 again, and after rook d1, king g2, I have nothing better than rook a1, but after queen takes, white is an extra rook, and this would be a clean win. So after knight b6 here, I thought for a while and I resigned the game. The main reason I was thinking, again, for people who are watching this, sure, wondering why I thought for like a good 15-20 minutes, it was mainly because I was just thinking through the game earlier and wondering what I should have done differently. And as we've seen in my analysis here, and as I was thinking during the game, And as I realized, it simply wasn't enough. This idea with bishop a7 and bishop g4 early in the game to try and spice it up was simply a little bit too optimistic by me, but you do have to give credit to Teimour. He obviously played a very good game. He found a couple of really critical moves. I thought queen e2 was a great move, and then much later on, using those 30 minutes and playing this move queen g4, well, those two moves were excellent moves. It's a shame that Teimour had to find them against me today, as opposed to in some of the other games. But that is life. That's how it goes. So it's a very tough loss. Obviously, I'm back on an even score, and effectively the tournament is over in terms of competing for first place, but there still are 5 more rounds to go, so we'll see how I play in the next couple of games. Tomorrow will be a rest day, so there will be no recap, but I will be back to do a recap after my 10th round game on Wednesday against Alireza Firouzja. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Obviously, I'm a little bit disappointed, but that's how it goes sometimes. That is the life of a chess player, but we'll come back stronger. So hope you guys enjoyed the recap, and I will see you guys all very, very soon.